Hello for the second video in English. Today I will read an article about the project of the United States of Europe. But since it's a quite long article, it's about 2000 words, I will first summarize. And what I do is actually to criticize the project of the United States of Europe on the basis of the fact that for me it is impossible for democracy to bring together peoples who actually speak different languages, because politics is about understanding complex and articulated topics. In order to do this, I start from an interpretation of a text that is considered like the foundation of the European Union, which is a booklet for a free and united Europe of Altiero Spinelli and Enrico Rossi, which may be not that known in outside Italy. Let's start with this very interesting talk. Here we are. So, in this talk, I will speak about the European Union and about the project of a united Europe. I will start from the booklet for a free and united Europe, a draft manifesto, better known as the Manifesto of Ventotene, signed by Altiero Spinelli and Enrico Rossi. I read it for a meeting on the so-called European Dream. In the advertises that about this meeting, there was a reference to this text, so I thought, why not to read this book? Besides, it is an important text, continuously cited with great reverence, considered the precursors project of the current European Union. I was afraid of running into a big book, but I was mistaken. It is a manifesto of 7,000 words or so, which can be read in an hour, or a little more if you take some notes, of course. I was expecting a text particularly inspired by ideals of equality and democracy for a Europe that, after so many centuries of internal wars, could put aside national peculiarities and unite for a project of collaboration and peace. They could guarantee freedom and prosperity to peoples. But my expectations have been disappointed, even with some pleasure. It is always nice to see how wrong the vulgates of the sacred texts of tradition are, how much they simplify, trivialize, and misrepresent. Who claims that in our school and even universities we have a serious problem because we arrived at the educational paradox that of an author we do not read the text he wrote, but rather the summaries, comments, essays, and interpretations that the experts have dedicated to him, who claims this as all my support. And to make this thing even worse, sometimes the same experts, scholars, are based more on secondary literature than on primary texts. I don't know if it is a matter of malice or laziness. What is certain is that reading the texts firsthand is always revealing. For this reason, for many centuries the Church has endeavored to prohibit the reading of the sacred texts to those who were not part of the clergy. There would have been too many cases of heresies and protests, like more than there have been. Anyway, the reading of the Manifesto of Ventotene has been meaningful to me because it let me reflect on the idea of a united Europe. As to the content of the book, let's start by saying that the main thesis of the manifesto is that democracy is a weak institutional form which, as for an inescapable destiny, always ends up with a crisis, opening the door to the authoritarianism and dictatorship. In this view, fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany are almost a logical consequence of the previous democratic institutions. Now, this position questions the goodness of democratic institutions as the foundation of the liberal state, and could not be further from my sensitivity nor of any other democratic. We could somehow justify the authors by saying that when the manifesto was written in 1944, a strong anti-parliamentarism and a deep mistrust of democracy were still widespread. democracy was considered as a weak and inert form of government. And indeed, at the time of World War II, the European democracies, with the exception of the United Kingdom, were terribly weak. Many had seen the authoritarian turn, others had faltered, others had fallen. And nevertheless, the contempt for democracy is an indelible stain of this book that cannot be accepted nor fully justified. But there is more. According to Spinelli and Rossi, at the end of the war, a group of revolutionary socialists would have had to exploit the collaboration of Democrats and Communists to beat totalitarianism, and then to get rid of them and to establish a new form of a European superstate that would inaugurate an unspecified new democracy through an intermediate passage of dictatorial government. Creepy, right? I quote the decisive passage of the book to make clear what disregard for democracy inspired these theorists of United Europe. During the revolutionary crisis, it is up to this movement, i.e. the movement of revolutionary socialists, to organize and guide progressive forces, utilizing for its purposes all the popular organs which form spontaneously as ardent crucibles in which the revolutionary masses are melted, not for the drawing up of plebiscites, but rather waiting to be guided. It derives the vision and security of what must be done not from a previous consecration of what is yet to be the popular conscience, but the knowledge of representing the deepest necessities of modern society. In this way, it issues the initial regulations of the new order, the first social discipline directed to the unformed masses. This dictatorship by the Revolutionary Party will form the new state, and surrounding this state will grow the new democracy. In this passage, there is everything that we could consider as subversive, authoritarian, and anti-democratic thought. And this is even more shocking, for many pro-European politicians, especially Italians, regret that the Ventotene Manifesto project was not implemented. They probably never read it, and if they have read it, they have not understood it, or they do not remember it, or again, they are particularly undemocratic types. I say, on the contrary, fortunately, such a project has not been accomplished. But after reading this kind of dystopian pamphlet, I began to reflect on what the European Union is now, on what it wants to become, and on how it interacts with the question of democracy. Many Europeanists see the ultimate goal of European integration in the creation of an hyperstate, that is, the United States of Europe on the model of the United States of America. According to the dreams of many Europeanists, in the future, 500 million Europeans will be called to elect not only the European Parliament, but also a President of the United States of Europe, with powers, prerogatives and limitations similar to those of the current North American president. And I asked myself, it is really a dream of an enlarged democracy, or perhaps it is a nightmare of a Frankenstein-like institutional form? I lean towards the second case. I could cite many reasons to support my position, but here I will concentrate only on one, namely the language. The main concern is, how is it possible to bring together peoples from 27 different countries or more who speak 24 different languages? 27 different countries who speak 24 different languages. Politics is a complex affair and requires an understanding of articulated topics and arguments. The full mastery and the communion of language are therefore two fundamental aspects of democracy. Language is the main element for building membership in a community and therefore for making politics. We cannot feel satisfied with the idea that in the future politicians and voters of a united Europe will understand each other more or less easily through simultaneous translations. Know that Europeans of the new generation would all know English. This is not only going to be true, but even if it happens, English will never be the first language of Europeans. and this is an unavoidable fact. The language we speak, besides being the instrument of complex communication, is also an essential factor of identity and culture. And even with all possible openness, those who do not speak our language will always be perceived as foreigners, for the simple fact that communication will present sometimes unsurmountable obstacles. And if we think that democracy is based on debate and information, which are linguistic facts, then we can only come to the conclusion that a healthy democracy cannot exist in a hyperstate where people are not speaking the same language as first language. The Germans of the future will continue to inform themselves in the German language, the Greeks in the Greek language, and these can only perpetuate differences. Someone could object, what about Switzerland and Belgium? These are also plurilingual states, right? Right, that someone would be right, but consider them for a moment. Both are very small and with a small population, which favor a close relationship with the central power. If you want to protest, it doesn't take long to arrive at the palaces of power. But there are other objections. Belgium, for example. Belgium, even if united by the monarchy, is in fact crossed by a certain opposition between the two French and Flemish communities. Since it united in 1830, its population has not in fact acquired full bilingualism even today. Politics is also fragmented. The parties are divided into French and Flemish speaking parties, without considering the small German community. And this makes a clear distinction between the territories. Moreover, there are 4 governments, the federal, the French, the Flemish and the German, confirming that whilst the Belgians live in the same territory, the languages remain a strong identity element. In addition to this, there is the Flemish separatism, which has very deep origins and which today is represented by right-wing pro-European parties such as the NVA, the New Flemish Alliance, which gathers also very considerable consensus, and right-wing Eurosceptic populist parties like the Vlaams Belang. And Switzerland? Switzerland does not suffer from separatist tensions. There is a substantial pacification between the various communities, which are mainly German, French, Italian and Romansh. But Switzerland is also a unique example of direct democracy mixed with party democracy. This means that Swiss politics are characterized by frequent recourse to referenda, which are not only abrogative but also proactive. It is a very fascinating case of management of power, which in any case would not fit into a very extensive, populous and varied state as the eventual United States of Europe would be. And although direct democracy has undoubted advantages, on the other hand it seems to have some flaws. The referenda, for example, are so frequent that they seem to have tied a substantial part of the Swiss electorate, to the point that the turnout rarely exceeds 50% of voters, which is certainly not the sign of a healthy democracy. Yet, even in the case of Switzerland, the linguistic difference is also reflected in the vote. The French Swiss almost always vote in the opposite way to the German-speaking Swiss, and since the latter are the majority, they often impose themselves on all the other Swiss. One last thing on the multilingual Switzerland that could seem the ideal model for the federal Europe. Has anybody noted that Switzerland has no intention of joining the European Union? What an irony that the model of a multilingual state does not believe in the project of a multilingual hyperstate. And so we come to the conclusion. The project of a Europe politically united on the model of the United States of America is strongly detrimental to the management of democratic power, because it would unite people with different languages, unable to fully understand each other. And even if the project were to be implemented, I believe that linguistic and cultural differences would eventually prevail and disintegrate it, perhaps at a very high price, such as organized violence, internal war. When it comes to taking the model of the United States of America, very few, too few, mention the fact that only 80 years after its foundation, there was a long civil war that lasted 4 years and left over 600,000 dead. And it is useful to remember not only that North and South Americans spoke the same language, but also that the differences between the North and the South were not more evident than the current ones between North and South Europe. And if the project of a political unification of Europe is the germ of a future violent conflict without anyone noticing it, with this question I conclude this paranoid suggestion and end with a short proposal. Contrary to what you may think, I am a Europeanist. I am convinced that the free movement of people and goods is a goal of civilization that has brought prosperity and peace throughout Europe since the 50s, years of the first free trade agreements. I am convinced that studying and working abroad in one of the European countries are experiences that I wish to the present and new generations. I believe that Europe, through its parliament, can at the same time respect the particularities and sovereignties of the member states on one hand, and on the other hand, it could homologate the countries to high quality standards of life for all of its citizens, but without imposing diktat, nor out, nor repressive or punitive policies. Europe could be a guiding light for those all over the world who believe in solidarity, collaboration and peace among different countries. Europe, instead of following the fantasy of a hyperstate, with a strong president, a single policy and a fearsome army, would rather recover the pacifist, libertarian and collaborative spirit at the origin of the first European treaties. So that's it. 17 minutes. It's too long, but anyway, see you next time and thank you for watching.